Hi everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Gina Chavez and I am with the Center for Public Policy Priorities. This morning we are here for a special live edition of Point of Order Video, a series where we're highlighting what should be at the top of our legislators' agendas. And the reason we're live this morning is because we've come across what may possibly be the worst idea at the Texas Legislature yet. This Thursday, the House will vote on House Bill 28. And here to talk with me in detail about why this is not a great idea for Texas is our senior fiscal analyst, Dick Levine. Welcome, Dick.
Well, thank you, Gina. Happy to be here, although it's not good news about House Bill 28. In brief, what it would do is eliminate the franchise tax. The franchise tax brings in $8 billion for every state budget. It goes primarily to pay for schools. It's our third largest source of tax revenue, and it's our only business tax, and House Bill 28 would eliminate it totally.
Well, and I know we want to get into this a little more, but we do have a very special guest who only has a short time with us. So we'd like to invite Representative Donna Howard to give us a little more background on what she's hearing at the House, and then we'll kind of dive into the details a little more.
Okay. So, what are you hearing in the House? Is anybody paying attention to this bill, or is everything else that's going on?
I think everything else that's going on, it really is amazing to me that we're not talking about this because, as you point out, this is a huge source of revenue for our budget. We made policy decisions last session that are already creating the situation we have now, where we are challenged to find enough money without cuts, which we are actually proposing this time. And now we're talking about, even with those cuts, further reducing revenue streams. It makes no sense.
Now that's a good point. Is last session the franchise tax was cut by $2.6 billion. This at minimum would be even 1/3 bigger than that. So they're making decisions now that are going to affect, if you're on Appropriations Committee again next year, it's going to be even worse than this year.
Yeah, you know, and what makes this even more egregious for me is that we have a lot of unfunded liabilities. We are still using general revenue dedicated funds to balance our budget. And yet we're going to talk about decreasing the revenue streams when we have these issues that need to be covered, not to mention the growth that we need to have of our population in education and healthcare and all the other things that we're required to. So, I mean, it makes no fiscal sense. It's certainly not a conservative approach to budgeting.
No, in fact, one thing, and we haven't mentioned, is these things are on autopilot. There's certain formulas. The Senate has a different bill, but they have the same idea. Certain triggers that would just eliminate or at least phase back step by step the franchise tax. So the legislature would be deciding in the House on Thursday to set in motion something that couldn't be reversed, even if it doesn't take effect for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. Whoever may be here then is going to have to deal with decisions made this week.
Well, and that's part of the problem, what we're seeing right now with this session. Certainly with the decision made last session to dedicate the $5 billion worth of sales tax growth to transportation does have some mechanism in it to kind of put a governor on that to a certain extent. But the bottom line is that's not going to happen because we're not going to not fund transportation. So we're going to have that available revenue off the table. We've already, back in 2006, when the franchise revision came about for the margin tax, that was all about the big property tax swap for public education. And we have continued to erode that source of revenue, even though it was never sufficient in the first place,
well,
since then.
Without going into detail, the change in the franchise tax means that when they start to cut the franchise tax, in the beginning it comes 100% out of our schools, 100% out of the foundation school program. Right. Which means if people are voting for this bill, they really can no longer complain about high property taxes because they're eliminating the state's ability to fund schools, leaving it to the local property taxes.
And we've been, of course, as you're pointing out, we have been over-relying on that source of funding for our schools. As you point out, this will just exacerbate that situation. We will have no state funds to help offset that, and we will continue to push it off on the property taxpayers. Their property tax is getting higher and higher.
And it also means, because the franchise tax is our only tax that's paid only by business. Business, of course, does pay property tax. It does pay sales tax.
Correct.
This is our only business tax. Well, business gets a lot of benefits from the state budget. I mean, we train their workforce. We build the roads that get their goods to market, and now they won't even be contributing.
Well, and this particular tax was created with the Blue Ribbon Committee appointed by Governor Perry that John Sharp headed. I think it was 24 different industries were on this Blue Ribbon Committee. They decided this was what they wanted, and then ever since then said, no, we don't want it after all. I think you're right to point out that business does benefit, and they certainly, I think they contribute, of course, through property and sales tax, but having some kind of a business tax that they can agree upon, we need that in place first before we get rid of what we currently have.
Well, you know, that's interesting. Businesses, of course, are more than happy to say, if you're going to cut our taxes, that's okay with us. But they haven't been pushing this. This appears to be just straight ideological. It makes no sense from a budget point of view.
Yeah.
Business isn't complaining the franchise tax. I mean, there's problems with it, but they're not complaining about its burden. So what is behind this?
I think the ideology is probably the best answer I can come up with as well. And I've got to hit the floor, so
Okay.
I'm going to take off.
Well,
thank y'all for doing this.
stopping
Appreciate
by,
y'all
of
talking
course.
about it.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
guys.
All right, well, once again, thanks so much to Representative Donna Howard for taking some time this morning before she gets into the House I think we kind of just broached the subject. So for those of you who are just now joining us, what we're talking about is House Bill 28, which hits the floor this Thursday for a vote, and it's potentially the worst idea at the Texas Leg yet. So Dick, let's talk a little bit more about what is actually in this bill. And dive into some of the details about what is the franchise tax, why is it so important for Texas, and especially for Texas education?
Okay, well, the franchise tax is the main business tax we have. It's paid by all businesses. It's also called the margins tax because it's imposed on the difference or the margin between a company's gross receipts and its cost of paying its workers or buying goods. And it's been in place since 2006. It was put there to help respond to a school finance decision from the Texas Supreme Court. So that's why a good chunk of it goes to buy down property taxes to pay for our schools. So if you eliminate the franchise tax, there'll be less money for schools and a lot more pressure on our local school property taxes. So the legislature seems to be pushing and pulling in different directions at the same time. They know that people are unhappy with a high level of property taxes, especially school property taxes, but the way you lower those property taxes is by increasing the state's share. Once upon a time, the state at least paid half of the cost of schools, and now it's down below 40%. And then they're going to eliminate the franchise tax, which is what is funding the property tax relief. I mean, they really are. They don't know their own mind. They're just cutting taxes, just for its own sake without thinking through the consequences.
Right. Well, and you just mentioned earlier with Representative Howard that it doesn't seem like this is even coming from the businesses. This is not something that they're upset about. It's not something that, they seem to be pushing. And so, the idea that this is even out there, much less going to take a vote on Thursday, and no one seems to know about it.
I know, it leaves, it's hard to, it's hard to explain because it makes no sense whatsoever. And when it went through the Senate, it came to the Senate floor. Senator Nelson had the Senate version. There was zero discussion. I mean, literally zero. She explained what it was in 30 seconds and then went through all the motions in the Senate. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes for this extremely important long-term change in funding for our schools and the rest of our budget. So we're hoping that at least the House will pay more attention. But as you know, there's a big issue coming up tomorrow on the House floor about sanctuary cities, which will affect the lives of many, many people. It's a very important bill. And then they threw this next most important bill on the next day when people are going to be tired and they're not going to fight. I mean, very clever from the point of view of whoever's pushing this, but it's cheating us from the chance to really debate the pros and cons of this very, very important change in how we fund our budget.
Right. Well, and I can't help but think of the impact on, education. Obviously, last legislative session and two legislative sessions ago, it's like we're constantly feeling like we're aiming at Texas education and undercutting that funding, and now we're talking about school vouchers, we're talking about the franchise tax, and more it just seems like education is the dartboard that we're going after, and I'm just not understanding.
It's self-destructive. I mean, there really is no good explanation. It makes no sense whatsoever. And you know, another thing is there are what are called tax equity notes attached to these bills. And the Legislative Budget Board, which makes the official estimates, shows that 30% of the benefit of this tax cut won't even stay in Texas, because the businesses that will benefit, you know, increase their profits, are often, they're great big businesses, and they're owned by shareholders in New York City, or pensions funds in Germany, or somebody else outside of Texas. So nearly a third of the benefit of this that's taking money from our schools won't even stay in the state.
Wow.
I know. It leaves you speechless. It's really hard to explain.
Well, you know, okay, so I guess diving into the bill a little bit more, you know, I know that it apparently only gets triggered, right, if something happens. So let's talk a little bit more about the details of that, you know, for somebody who may just be reading an article and saying, oh, well, it looks like it's safe because this isn't going to go into effect until, you know, we have a good economic growth. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
Well, the trouble with the trigger in general is you set up the trigger, or, you know, light the fuse, if you want to think about it that way now, and you don't know what the situation's going to be when the bomb goes off. In the House version, it's tied to a cash balance, how much money is left over at the end of the biennium. But that cash balance might include the dedicated funds that Representative Howard mentioned, which are really collected for a specific purpose, and the legislature's been using to balance the budget, which is a kind of scheming way to do these things. Now you can be using the GR dedicated funds to justify a tax cut when it's not even money that's honestly available. The other thing is, you know, you can mess with the cash balance. Like the House plan, the House budget plan will delay a payment to the schools that should be made at the end of August, and they're going to delay it into September, which is the next biennium, and you don't have to worry about it yet. And all of a sudden it looks like we have $2.5 billion more, which we do, but of course we're going to owe it 5 days after the next biennium starts, so it's not real, it's like cutting a check. You know, you write the check now, you know you'll have the money, hope you'll have the money in the bank by the time they come to cash it.
Yeah.
But that would count, and that could trigger a tax cut, which would be a permanent tax cut based on this little jiggling of your accounts.
And as we, you know, even thinking about, you know, the business aspect that you were talking about, right? How there's a lot of businesses, you know, are very interested in Texas. We have obviously, you know, we've been kind of on the, I guess, wish list of a lot of states for the kind of, you know, business growth and things that we have had here. But then, you know, as we're attracting people from outside of Texas, and then they, you know, don't even contribute to our state. You know, it's basically allowing them not to contribute in the ways that, you know, as you said,
right,
we're
taking advantage of us.
Training their workers, you know, we're building the roads that they can ship their goods out on, and at the same time, right, they get to come in and take advantage. So is this, I don't know.
Well, as I say, the business community doesn't seem to be what's pushing this, at least based on the public statements of them. Like I say, they'll take it if somebody's forcing it on them. But the good ones, recognize that they need the infrastructure, both the human infrastructure of a well-trained workforce and the physical infrastructure of the roads and all. And the businesses, some have testified, you know, this is actually with respect to the rainy day fund, which the legislature's been very reluctant to use, even when it's necessary to prevent harmful budget cuts. And the oil and gas industry came in and said, we don't mind paying taxes, but we wish you'd use them for something. You know, they understand the necessity for investing in the future. That's how they do it in their business. That's how they know the state should be doing it, but the state's not. And if this bill passes, we'll have that much less, $8 billion out of maybe a $100 billion budget. That is a chunk, and will really squeeze even more than we're squeezing this year on everything that people need to move ahead.
Now, when it funds education, is there a specific, you know, I mean, is it everything? Is it funding teacher salaries? Is it funding, you know, teacher retirement? You know, or is there a certain portion?
It's going to it goes through the property tax relief fund, because that's what this was intended to do, is 10 years ago to reduce property taxes. But the way you reduce property taxes is by putting more state money into the schools. So it goes through this so-called property tax relief fund straight into the foundation school program, and that's the state aid formulas. That's the money that flows on to every school district to help them pay for their teachers and to keep class sizes small. and pay for everything else that you need. It's more than just teachers, of course. You need all the support staff, the cafeteria, and the bus drivers, and the counselors, and the librarians. I mean, to do it right costs money, and it's worth it. But you can't do it if you don't have the money.
Right. Amen. Well, and yeah, I can't help but think, I'm a product of Austin Public Schools, Texas Public Schools, and I had amazing teachers and wonderful public schools, and that was not that long ago. And so, I think just my heart's just, going out to the people that don't have the kind of support that even I had then. And it's because, there's so many things. The school finance system hasn't been updated in 30 years. And, and then there's bills like this that come across that kind of everyday citizens don't know how it's really going to affect Texas families. Is there something that people can be doing right now?
Yeah, the House hasn't voted yet. So the first thing to do right now is to write to your representative. The person that's really, there's 150 of them. So their districts are not that large. It's easy to get in touch with them. They have district offices. By the time they get back to the district this weekend might be too late. So you better call them or email them right now and tell them vote no on House Bill 28. House Bill 28 by Representative Bonin, which would repeal the franchise tax. That's what we're talking about. That's what would cause so many problems. We know what it's like having a tight budget. It's been a terrible experience writing the budget this session, where they're cutting UT by 10% and they're not increasing the amount of money going to schools, and they're just cutting back across the board. That's just the beginning. If this thing passes, it's going to be like this every year, because either it will be a tight budget because we have no money, or it'll be a tight budget because these tax cuts are coming in. Either way, it's just going to be tough from now on if this thing passes.
Wow. So if you're just now joining us, what we're talking about today, first of all, I'm Gina Chavez, this is Dick Levine. We're here with the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and this is a special edition of Point of Order Video, which is a series where we talk about what should be at the top of our legislators' agendas. This morning we're here live because what may possibly be the worst idea at the Texas Leg yet is going to be voted on by the House this Thursday. And it's House Bill 28, and essentially it would eliminate the franchise tax, which is one of the main funding sources of our public education system here in Texas. We've got a few questions from people that are joining us online. So, people are asking, what's the mood in the Texas House?
Well, I think it's distraction, to tell you the truth. There's a lot of focus, for instance, on the Sanctuary Cities bill, which is coming up tomorrow. It's a very important bill. It's attracted a lot of attention and a lot of controversy, and I think that everybody is thinking about Wednesday and not thinking about Thursday when House Bill 28 comes up. So that's part of it. I think there's a lot of people who recognize the problems it would cause. They're afraid, of course, politics is involved, and I think they would have been happier to not have it come to the floor at all. Once it does, a lot of these people are going to, we've heard senators say this too, this is bad, I'm voting yes, because, they have their own self-interest in mind too.
Right. Well, and then, what about the argument that some people say cutting the franchise tax is actually going to somehow generate more revenue?
Oh, yeah, that's an argument you always hear with tax cuts. And it's true to about this much. If you cut, say, $1 billion, the state doesn't actually lose $1 billion, it loses $900 million, because there's a tiny bit of maybe more economic activity. But what's definitely not true is that tax cuts do not pay for themselves. You are not better off for cutting taxes, especially if you're in the situation Texas is in, where we're way underinvested. We've been deferring making the investments that would pay off big time in the future, especially in education, but across the board. And that's why there's been so much emphasis in the last session or two, and Representative Howard mentioned it, about getting money to highways. Because it's perfectly obvious you almost can't go anywhere, certainly within the city of Austin, and between big cities in Texas. I mean, it's just inadequate capacity. Well, that's happening in other places too, like in our schools and our universities. It's just not so obvious because people don't have to go deal sitting in traffic every day. But our kids have to deal with sitting in overcrowded classrooms or in teachers who turn over because they really can't support themselves and their families on the salaries. I mean, it is just as bad in deferred maintenance in those areas of the state budget too, but it's not so obvious.
Right, right. And we're not in the classrooms fighting that fighting that battle and getting frustrated and having a voice. Because that's the thing is our kids, they can't vote. You know, they don't have a voice. And so we have to be their voice. And so it's really frustrating that the people who are supposedly are, you know, kind of most upstanding, right, that are our businesses, that are the ones who actually kind of created the franchise tax in the first place in order to give back, you know, that now suddenly this is being retracted.
Yeah, as Representative Howard mentioned, when the franchise tax, what's now called the margins tax, was reformed in 2006, there was a large task force with all the different industries represented, and there was a bargain struck. And that's only 10 years later. I mean, you know, they can't complain. This was their deal. But I don't, as I say, it doesn't seem like it's the businesses who are complaining. It's political. It's ideological, and it is so short-sighted and so self-destructive that it's almost hard to explain because it makes no sense whatsoever.
Right. Now, I know the franchise tax doesn't just support public education. So, you know, if it's possible not to get too much into the weeds, but kind of what else does this support in Texas?
Well,
you know, why else is the franchise tax important?
The way it's set up is that the amount that would have been collected under the old franchise tax before these 2006 changes goes to general revenue, which goes to everything that the state pays for, you know, the higher ed and prisons and health and human services and everything, the parks, everything that we do is supported by that amount of the franchise tax. And then the extra money that's brought in because of these changes made 10 years ago goes exclusively to schools. So when you cut the franchise tax and you're cutting off the top, from the beginning, it's 100% out of our schools. And then once you get all the way down, then it's from the entire budget.
Wow. I can't help but think of your image of, you know, kind of lighting a fuse, that's what they're doing right now, and that, you know, the bomb may not be going off immediately, but when it does go off, you know, where are we going to be when that happens?
I hope that people are following all of us on Twitter. My account is D Levine, D-L-A-V-I-N-E, and I've been tweeting as much as I can about this, and I've tried to come up with ways to explain it to people. And I don't know if you remember the movie Dr. Strangelove. That involves a missile attack, a nuclear missile launch, and a bomber that's heading off over Russia, and it turns out they can't call it back. And that's exactly what's happening here. If they pass the HB 28 or the Senate version, they are launching a tax cut that will be triggered by the various things, the cash balance or something like that, and they won't be able to call it back. And 4 years from now or 6 years from now, when maybe they've come to their senses and they realize we just don't have enough money to do what we need to do, it will be politically very, very difficult to vote against a tax cut that's already in place. The same thing as launching the nuclear bomber that you can't call back, even though you know you shouldn't have done it.
Right. How will discussions about school finance in the House be affected and impacted by these bills?
Well, you know, in school finance, because this is real life, you really can't change the formulas if you're going to create winners and losers. Honestly, the only way you make school finance work is if everybody wins at least a little. Well, it takes money. And here we are taking away the money that might have been needed to rationalize our school finance system, make it so it's not so complex that allegedly only 6 people understand it, make it so that it's not so heavily reliant on recapture, on local property taxes being sent to the state to be redistributed to other school districts. I mean, that's very important for equity so that we the amount of money each school district has is relatively equal, so that kids get a good education, no matter, as they say, no matter what zip code they live in. But it's got a little out of hand because the state's not holding up its end of the bargain, and so local property taxes are doing it. Cutting the franchise tax that funds the foundation school program is going in the wrong direction.
Right. Once again, for those of you just now joining us, I'm Gina Chavez, and this is our senior fiscal analyst, Dick Levine, at the Center for Public Policy Priorities. Today we are here with a special edition of Point of Order Video, which is a series where we talk about what should be at the top of our legislators' agendas. Today we're shooting this special edition live at the Capitol this morning because what may be the worst idea to cross the Texas Legislature yet, which I know is a high bar, is HB 28, which essentially would eliminate the franchise tax. Obviously that doesn't sound very bad if you don't know what the franchise tax is, but that's why we're here this morning, is to talk about the importance of the franchise tax, especially for funding public education in Texas.
Yeah, so let's just talk about the franchise tax. It brings in $8 billion per state budget. Now, I know the state budget's big, but even in a big state budget, $8 billion matters. The franchise tax is the third largest source of tax revenue that the state has. And it goes primarily to fund schools and then to fund everything else that we need done. So it's a very important part of our tax system. It was cut last session, and that's one of the reasons why this year's budget is so tight, is because of the tax cuts and the revenue diversions they made last session. This would just make future budgets that much tighter.
Wow. Please feel free, I haven't said this, but feel free to type in your comments and questions below. We do have a little team here with us, and they're handing us your questions. You can also follow us on Twitter at CPPP_TX. Dick Levine also has his own account, which is D Levine, or D underscore. No, it's just D Levine. L-A-V-I-N-E. So once again, that's D-L-A-V-I-N-E, and he's on Twitter. I'm also on Twitter, Gina Chavez, G-I-N-A-C-H-A-V-E-Z. Anyway, so please keep your questions coming. Tell your friends to tune in. Dick, can you talk a little bit more about how people can, actually try to make an impact before this Thursday, before the House takes a vote on HB 28?
Well, that's it. We're talking about something that's going to come to the House floor for a vote in 48 hours from now. I mean, literally 2 days. So you have to right away write to or call, even better, call your state representative. If you don't know who they are, you go to the Texas Capitol website, and there's something, a little area called Who Represents Me. So if you're not familiar with who your state rep is, it's easy to find out, and that will give you the contact information. I think phone calls are best, to tell you the truth. And I've been in offices when phone calls come in, because they do come in pretty often, and they will write down how many calls there are and what the people say. So it is worth doing, because the representatives understand they can't come back in 2 years if they don't satisfy their voters. And if they hear from their voters that they are against eliminating this very important support for our schools and other public services, they may take action on Thursday. And then don't forget your senators. The Senate has passed its version of the bill. The House version's coming up on Thursday, but they're different bill numbers, they're different triggers for this tax cut. So one or the other is going to have to go to the other chamber. So while you're on the phone, call your senator too and tell them you're against any more tax cuts until they take care of investments in our children and everything else that the state budget is doing for all of us.
Right. One of the questions that came through is, how would the average person notice a cut in the franchise tax?
Well, you wouldn't notice, if you own a business, you might notice it, although small businesses are exempted. You need more than actually a little more than $1 million in gross receipts before you even have to pay the franchise tax.
Okay.
But what you will notice, if you're a school kid, you'll notice because suddenly there's 2 more kids in your classroom that didn't used to be there. If you're a teacher, you'll notice because you're not getting any more money. You're working just as hard, and things cost more that you need for you and your family. and the school district can't afford to pay you anymore. Or you might notice if you're reliant on the state for any kind of health and human services and you discover you can't get it, or the waiting lists are too long, or doctors aren't taking Medicaid because we don't reimburse them at a reasonable rate. It's indirect, but you will notice it in sort of the erosion of services. Our parks aren't being taken care of well enough. I mean, it's across the board, and it's kind of slow. It's never from one day to the next, but if you go to other states, actually, you will notice that somehow their roads are better, their parks are better, and you may not see their schools, but you can see their school buildings, and often their school buildings are better too.
Yeah. Well, and I think, all of us, especially being a native Texan, we're not okay with that. We're not okay with other states being better than us. But I think it goes to show that, like, everything starts with education. All of these things start with our public education system and kind of end with our public education system. That is the litmus test for how well our state is doing. And right now, there's some battles that seem to be going in the very opposite direction.
I mentioned the Legislative Budget Board. That's part of the legislature, and they put out what's called a fiscal note, showing the 5-year cost for these changes. Like, for instance, on House Bill 28, it shows that it could lower the amount for the next budget by up to $3.5 billion. It gives those kinds of numbers. I've always thought there should be an 18-year fiscal note showing that if you do something to cut back on pre-K and early childhood, there will be costs out 18 years until hopefully the kid graduates from high school. Because you have to take that long-term kind of view. I mean, you know how long it takes for a child to grow up, and the kind of investment you personally make in time and energy in raising them. It's the same thing when you're the state and you're responsible for funding education. You have to think long-term like that. So people won't notice right away if this franchise tax is cut. But 15 or 20 years ago, the state will be worse off. Its people will be poorer. People will have less opportunity to support themselves and their families because we cut taxes now and cut off our ability to make the investments in the future that we need to make.
Right. Well, and it's so hard with these long-term decisions, too, that, even when, if we look back and we say, well, we cut the franchise tax, it's not, because it's not an immediate change and it's not a big change, it's so hard to have people understand, that all of these tiny incremental changes make a huge impact, but it's hard to kind of point a finger and be like, that was that's where it started.
Yeah, it's drip, 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 drip. In the last session, they made changes that's the cause of the tight budget now. I know oil and gas prices aren't what they used to be, but that's not really the problem. It's the legislature suffering, and we are all suffering now because of decisions made 2 years ago. If they pass House Bill 28, 2 years from now, the next legislature is going to come in and have an even worse situation.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that a little bit. You just mentioned that, kind of how did we get to this tight budget this year? Let's
Sure.
look at that a little bit.
Well, we've calculated that the changes made last session reduced the amount available to fund this budget by about $10 billion. 2.6 of that was they cut the franchise tax last session. You think that would have been enough, actually. They cut it by a quarter, give it a rest. Don't keep pushing on it. Another thing they did is they took the sales tax, which is by far the biggest tax that Texas has, and took $5 billion off it and gave it exclusively to highways. Then they did other things, like it used to be the DPS and the Department of Motor Vehicles were paid out of the highway fund. Now they're paid out of general revenue. Well, that means more money for the highway fund, but less money in general revenue for everything else. And they also increased the homestead exemption by a little bit, the exemption that homeowners get from paying a little bit of their school property taxes. You add it all up, that's $10 billion less. And that's why they're thinking of doing things like cutting UT by 10%. Talk about short-sighted. Cutting back your premier higher education institution just makes 0 sense at all. People have choices. Students have choices. Faculty have choices. Why would they want to stay here when they can see the state's not even committed to keeping them going at the high level that we all want?
Right. Well, and even so, why would our legislators want to make these cuts? Explain it to us.
I cannot explain it. I mean, politics puts funny pressures on people. And as I said, I have heard the many, many legislators say, not even only in private, but sometimes publicly, this is a bad idea. If it comes to the House floor where my vote's going to be recorded and could be used against me in the next election, I'm going to have to vote yes, because they know how elections work, especially primaries, where only relatively few people show up and they're usually the most ideologically committed. So they know they're doing something that is dumb, but they find themselves forced to do it. It would be best if this bill never even came to the floor.
Right.
You could float it out, you could talk a lot about it, but not force people to make these bad decisions.
Right. For those who are just joining us, we're talking about House Bill 28, which will take a vote on the House floor this Thursday. It's potentially the worst idea yet to come down the pike for the Texas Leg this session. And I'm here with Dick Levine, our senior fiscal analyst at the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and we're talking about the repercussions of House Bill 28 and what it would mean to eliminate the franchise tax.
I was just going to say, we're doing this so we can talk directly to you, partly because it's been almost invisible in what some might call the mainstream media.
Right.
But it has hardly been covered at all. The other issues, which are some are important, some are unimportant, but they're all sort of more human interest stories. That's what's getting covered. This is just about money. And I guess some people just find that boring. But it is really, really important. And it is really, they say money is at the root of all evil. Money is actually the root of all good that the state could be doing if it had the money. So it's really important to pay attention to it. Just because we're the only people you've heard talk about it doesn't mean it's not important. It means the other folks who should be talking about it have all gotten distracted by other things.
Right. Well, and I feel like, politics kind of plays out everywhere, right? Because, who doesn't want to hear about kind of, the more human interest side? The problem is this has probably the largest human impact of all when we're talking about affecting public education, especially, affecting our kids, affecting the future of our state. And even, if these kids decide to leave our state and take their, take skills elsewhere or travel the world, like they're representing the state of Texas. And I know that I've had I was a product of public schools here in Texas, here in Austin, and I've had the chance to travel the world, and I'm always a Texan at heart. It's like it's in my blood, and so I think there's this part of me that just sees things like this come down at the legislature, and I'm just wondering how people can be behind this if they say that they're really for Texans. What would happen to property taxes if the franchise tax is cut or eliminated?
Well, the franchise tax now, a good chunk of it, and the part that would be eliminated first if it's being phased out, goes to the foundation school program. That's the state aid through the formulas, the school funding formulas you hear so much about. Well, if there's less money coming from the state, and local school districts still want to keep class sizes small and pay teachers and keep good teachers, they're going to have to raise the money themselves through their school property taxes. So if the franchise tax is eliminated and the state has less money to help out our schools, and our schools want to continue to do a good job, they will be coming to you and asking you to pay more property taxes.
Right, and what do you think people are going to say about that?
Well, to tell you the truth, people are willing to pay for things they care about. And people care a lot about their children. But, enough is enough. And in fact, 1/3 of school districts, out of the 1,000 school districts in the state, more than 300 are already at their maximum tax rate. There's nothing more they can do to help out their schools. They're maxed out by the cap the legislature's put on their ability to raise money.
Wow. Please feel free to submit your questions in the chat below. I hope you're joining us. If you are just now joining us, we're talking about House Bill 28, which would essentially eliminate the franchise tax. One of the questions we just got says, some people say the franchise tax needs fixing. The tax doesn't generate as much money as permitted, critics say. What would you tell them?
Well, there's two things. One is that when the tax was created, or at least reformed in 2006, it was intended to replace school property taxes. Because of a Texas Supreme Court opinion, excuse me, the legislature required all school districts to cut their property taxes by a third, but they promised them they'd be just as well off because the state would make up the difference. And they raised the cigarette tax, but mainly the money was going to come from this new and reformed franchise tax. As it turns out, it has fallen far short of the amount necessary to replace those school property taxes. And it created what we call a structural deficit. I mean, something built into the structure of our revenue and budget system of $14 billion, a huge amount, which meant either our schools were going to be shortchanged or somebody else was going to be shortchanged. Now, obviously, there's politics involved in this too, and the controller at the time warned that the franchise tax probably wasn't going to bring in as much as promised, but people poo-pooed her because she was about to run for governor against Rick Perry, and turns out she was right, but obviously she didn't win the election, and it left us with this great big hole in our budget. Now, there's one other thing about the franchise tax, which is a legitimate complaint. I mentioned it's now called the margins tax because it's based on the margin, or the difference between the amount of money a company brings in and the amount it pays its workers, or the amount it spends on various goods that it needs. The problem with that is, depending on how your business is structured, you could end up not making a profit and still owing the tax. And people are not happy with that,
Right.
which I can understand. The old franchise tax really used to be much more like a corporate income tax. You made a profit, you paid a tax. You didn't make a profit, you didn't pay a tax. So there are changes that could be made, but elimination is not going to solve the problem.
Right. Well, and so let's talk about this bill, about House Bill 28, and what, obviously it wouldn't go into effect this session, but when would it go into effect, and how would those changes, how would it happen?
Yeah, it wouldn't affect the budget that's right now in conference committee that's almost being written, but it would take effect whenever there's a cash balance at the end of a biennium. Once the state finishes its 2-year fiscal period, you look at how much cash is on hand and you say, cool, let's cut franchise tax by the amount of the cash we have on hand, up to $3.5 billion per biennium. And it could be that you can mess with the cash balance. You can delay payments or accelerate revenue. I mean, it's not an objective measure. It can be manipulated, but it's there, and it will be in statute. And 2 years from now, or 4 years from now, or 6 years from now, it'll go off with no further action by the legislature, even if the situation is not good, even if we have extra expenses nobody anticipated, oil's not doing as well, whatever it is, this thing will be set in stone, and there won't be any way out of it.
We have about 10 minutes left. For those of you that are just now joining us, we're talking about House Bill 28, which would essentially eliminate the Texas, the franchise tax, which is one of the huge components that funds our public education system. I'm Gina Chavez, this is Dick Levine, and we are with the Center for Public Policy Priorities. We're here live at the Texas Capitol, talking to you directly because this is that important that we're here live this morning. There's going to be a vote, unfortunately, in 2 days' time. On Thursday, the House is going to vote on HB 28, which would essentially eliminate the franchise tax. And so that's what we've been talking about. We have about 10 more minutes left. If you have any more questions, please feel free to type them in the chat window below. You can still tell your friends to join in the conversation. And we do encourage you, there is something you can do. Please call your legislators. If you don't know who your legislators are, you can go to the Texas House website and look at the tab that says who represents me, find out who represents you, call your legislator and tell them that you do not support any cuts to our public education system, do not support any tax cuts such as the franchise tax, that you don't support HB 28.
One thing we haven't mentioned is this thing has really been fast-tracked. It came out of committee, and it was, sort of sitting around, nothing much happening, and then it got sent to the Calendars Committee, Heard and Calendars Committee, and put on the floor all in 3 days. very unusual. So there's obviously some pressure pushing this forward, and that's why we need to push back to keep them from doing something that's going to cause long-term problems for all of us, for future state budgets, and for all of us who want a better state.
Right. Well, in talking, I mean, it's just unreal to me sometimes the aims that we take at our public education system. And I can't help but think most of the times when these cuts come across, it's, I don't know if this would be true with the franchise tax, but, who's going to be affected first? It's often lower income families, people who don't have the time to, maybe even be as involved in their kids' lives because they're holding down 2 or 3 jobs. They don't have a car. These are the people that need our voice the most.
Well, it's very clear who's going to be affected first. It's going to be our kids.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly where the money's coming from, is what's called the Foundation School Program, state aid for our public schools. And so the first people to notice it are going to be our kids.
Yeah.
But they won't realize that it's not right to have 32 kids in a classroom, and there used to be 28. They don't think of these things, but long term it's going to affect them because the teacher won't have as much time to spend with them. If they need a little extra help on something, they might not get it because there's just too many kids for the teacher to cope with, and that's because the state will have to cut back on its aid to our schools if House Bill 28 passes and the franchise tax is phased out to eliminate it.
Well, one of the things too, if you don't know, Dick Levine is actually quite a great resource on Twitter if you're following the Texas Ledge. And so please do follow his account, D Levine, DLAVINE. You can also follow the center, of course, where it's CPPP_TX. And one of our questions is, Dick, what are some of your favorite tweets about HB 28?
Oh, actually, you might as well have fun if you're doing this. So one of my favorites I just posted last night is excerpt from the kids' book, Good Night Moon. Good night moon, good night moon, good night state budget if House Bill 28 passes. It doesn't rhyme, but I hope it gets the point across.
We could work on it. Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, you're right. We definitely have to have a sense of humor. But the truth is, it's really hard because it's not funny. It's not a funny matter that our lawmakers essentially on Thursday are going to be voting for the future of our kids, and it's not going to look good if they pass it. So we do encourage you to call your legislators, call your senators, call your for this vote. Please call your Texas House representatives. The Senate also has a sister bill or a similar bill. What's the number for that one?
Senate Bill 17.
That's right.
That's already passed the Senate, but it's a different bill, and it's the same idea though. It's a triggered tax cut where they set in motion now tax cuts will take place in 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 years. But because they're different bills, Senate Bill 17 would have to be passed by the House before it became law, or this House Bill 28, if it is voted out of the House on Thursday, would have to go to the Senate. So it's worth calling your senators also. They're not doing anything about it this week the way the House is, but while you're on the phone, give them a call too and tell them we need the franchise tax. That $8 billion is really, really important to funding our schools and the rest of the state budget, and there's no reason to be cutting it now or setting in motion future cuts that will be irreversible.
Right.
It's as short-term thinking as there could possibly be, and tell them you'd rather take the money and invest it in the future of Texas.
Well, and I will say on a personal note, I've made far more phone calls than I ever have in my life this year, and I'm not going to lie, I was kind of scared to call my legislators. I was like, oh, I want to sound smart, and I don't, what do I say? And the staffers, there's been times where I haven't been able to get through, but when I did get through, everybody's been very nice. The staffers are often very nice. They either sit quietly and listen, or sometimes they, kind of ask questions. They want to know what zip code you're in, what your name is. So don't be afraid to call your legislators.
Yeah, you don't have to be an expert to call your legislator. You have to be one of their constituents, which is what they care about. but it makes a difference. As
Right.
I've been in offices, and they take each call seriously, and they log each call, and they show the results to the representative every day. I mean, this is how these representatives come back every year, is by being reelected. And if they hear that their constituents are not happy with eliminating $8 billion from the state budget with this franchise tax cut, they might change how they act on the House floor on Thursday.
Right. Well, and how do people find out if their legislator opposes or
Well,
supports HB 28?
Before the vote, ask. Say, I understand this bad bill is coming to the floor on Thursday. I certainly hope you're against it. Are you? And see what they say.
Put them on the spot. We have a couple more questions coming in before our end of time here. Please feel free to type in the window if you do have some more questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Once again, my name is Gina Chavez. This is Dick Levine. We are here with the Center for Public Policy Priorities live at the Texas Capitol for our first live edition of Point of Order Video. It's a series where we're talking about what should be at the top of our legislators' agendas, and also talking about the things, like this HB 28 that would essentially eliminate the franchise tax, and talking about why that should not be at the top of our legislators' agendas. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It has been a beautiful morning out here in the atrium, where they just had the rattlesnake roundup a few weeks ago. Anyway, we hope that you guys will continue to follow us. We have a lot of resources on our website at cppp.org. That's cppp.org. You can even look up franchise tax on our website, and we have some very specific, not too long, some briefs that talk about why the franchise tax is important. Our blog is an incredible source of information. That's the bettertexasblog.org. And you can always follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. On Twitter, we're CPPP_TX. You're on Facebook right now, and follow us on Instagram as well. And please make sure to follow Dick and his pursuits here at the Texas Ledge, and he's D. Levine on Twitter.
And I'll be sitting in the gallery on Thursday, typing as fast as my fingers will go, letting you know what's happening on House Bill 28 when it comes to the House floor on Thursday.
And in the meantime, we hope that you call your legislators, please, 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 and tell them to oppose, with all fervor, to oppose House Bill 28. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks for watching.